The sun was setting over the forest, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for miles across the quiet village where Liam lived. The world around him was familiar, peaceful, untouched by the chaos that raged beyond the borders of his small world. Liam had once been a man of action, a warrior whose name echoed in the halls of kings. But now, in his mid-40s, he had chosen solitude. He had turned his back on his old life, retreating into the forest to study the things that had always fascinated him: ancient texts, forgotten histories, and the complexities of the natural world. He had no family left, and the friends he had once fought beside were long gone. It was a quiet life, one he had grown accustomed to, or so he thought. The howl of a wolf broke the silence, sharp and distant. Liam paused, his book forgotten in his lap. The sound seemed out of place, though wolves roamed the woods. What was unusual was the way it carried, louder, almost human in its desperation. His instincts kicked in. Liam stood, closing the book with a soft snap, and moved toward the door of his cabin. The air outside was cooler than he expected, the wind carrying a sense of urgency. His hand instinctively rested on the hilt of the sword at his side, the weight of it a reminder of his past life. He wasn't expecting danger, yet something gnawed at the edge of his senses. Then he saw her. The woman emerged from the trees, her figure blurred in the twilight. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Tall, almost regal in her posture, she was dressed in furs, her skin a strange blend of human and something far more primal. Her eyes glowed faintly, a piercing amber that seemed to see through him. Her hair, wild and untamed, framed a face that was both fierce and captivating. Her lips, slightly parted as if she were about to speak, trembled with the weight of the words she had yet to say. Liam took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something in her presence that set his nerves on edge, yet he couldn't look away. "You," she said, her voice low and commanding. "You are him." "Who are you?" Liam asked, his voice more steady than he felt. "What do you want?" The woman stepped forward, her movements graceful but filled with an untamed power. She wasn't like the creatures of the forest. She was something more, something between man and beast. "I am Lyra," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I've come for you. The prophecy calls for you, the strongest human male." Liam's brow furrowed in confusion. "Prophecy? I don't understand." Her eyes softened for a moment, almost as if she regretted her harsh words. "You are needed," she continued. "The clan has searched for you, the strongest male, the one who can save us." Liam's mind raced. He had heard rumors of the beast folk, the creatures that roamed the deep forests, half human, half animal, living in secrecy. But he had never thought they would come for him, and he certainly hadn't expected a woman like this, so fierce and beautiful, to be the one to seek him out. "Save you?" he asked. "How?" Lyra's gaze flickered toward the forest, and her lips curled into a sad smile. "Our people are dying. The bloodline is fading. Only the strongest human male can restore what we've lost." She paused, her expression shifting, becoming more intense. "You are the one. The prophecy speaks of a man who can bring strength to our bloodline, to our people. A man whose power will be unmatched. And that man is you." Liam took a step back, his mind reeling. He was no longer the man he had once been. He had turned his back on that life years ago. The idea that some ancient prophecy would tie him to the fate of these creatures, the idea of mating with one of them, was absurd. "Listen, I think you've got the wrong person," Liam said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't want anything to do with your prophecy. I've left that world behind. I'm not your savior." Lyra's eyes flashed with a sudden intensity. "You don't have a choice," she said, her tone hardening. "The prophecy is not something you can escape. Our people have waited for centuries for this moment. You are the one who must fulfill it." Before he could respond, she was upon him. In a blur of motion, she gripped his arm with surprising strength, her touch both commanding and intimate. Her hand, warm and strong, seemed to sear through his sleeve, sending a jolt of heat through his skin. There was an undeniable power in her something primal that made his heart race. He could feel the tension between them, thick and almost unbearable. Her body was close now, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath against his cheek. Her scent, earthy, wild, intoxicating, mingled with the sharpness of the air around them. "Come with me," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "There is no time to argue. You must come now. The clan is waiting." Liam hesitated, torn between the urge to resist and something deeper that stirred within him. Her presence was magnetic, and there was an undeniable attraction that pulled at him. He hadn't felt this alive in years, not since the battles of his youth, but this was different. This was something else entirely. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Liam nodded. "I'm coming," he said, "but I don't know what you expect from me. I'm not your savior. I'm just a man." Lyra's eyes softened for a moment, and the grip on his arm loosened. For the briefest instant, there was something almost tender in her gaze, but it was quickly replaced by the fierce determination he had come to expect. "Just come with me," she said again. "You'll understand soon enough." With that, she began to lead him through the woods, her hand still gripping his arm. Liam had no choice but to follow. As they walked deeper into the forest, the distance between them seemed to grow smaller, the tension between them more palpable with each passing step. Liam couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. But how? He didn't know. All he knew was that whatever came next, he would have to face it, and that, somehow, filled him with both dread and something else, a flicker of anticipation. The forest around them seemed alive, its dense trees stretching high above, their ancient boughs whispering with the wind. As Lyra led Liam through the underbrush, her pace swift and determined, the world around him felt more like a dream. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and the sharp, fragrant bite of pine. Even as they moved through the familiar wilderness, it felt foreign, alien. The world he had once known was far behind him, and this new reality was just beginning to unfurl. Liam glanced at Lyra, who was moving ahead with purpose. Her figure was both elegant and fierce, her furred limbs blending into the environment like a creature born from the earth itself. He couldn't quite wrap his head around what she had told him about the prophecy, the need for the strongest human male. It all seemed too unbelievable, too unreal. Yet her presence was undeniable. The magnetic pull he felt when she touched him, even just briefly, lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the strange feeling that he was being drawn into something far greater than he understood. "You're quiet," Lyra said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. She slowed her pace for a moment, glancing back at him with a look that was both searching and unreadable. "Thinking about the prophecy?" "I'm trying to," Liam replied, his voice steady but uncertain. "But it doesn't make sense. I'm just a man who wants nothing to do with prophecies or battles." Lyra's amber eyes flickered with something like amusement, though there was an edge to her smile. "You may not want to be a part of it, but the prophecy doesn't care about your desires. It is already set in motion. The moment we met, you became a part of it." Liam frowned, glancing at her with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "I'm not your hero. I'm not even sure I'm the strongest." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling slightly. "You are, whether you know it or not." She paused, as if considering how much to reveal. "There is strength in you, Liam, and not just physical strength. The prophecy is more than just about who can wield a sword or kill a beast. It's about the strength to unite, to endure, to protect." The words hung in the air between them, and Liam felt the weight of her gaze. There was something in her eyes, a kind of sincerity that made him hesitate, made him wonder if there was more to the prophecy than just some ancient ritual. He had seen so much in his years as a warrior, things that had hardened him against blind belief in fate. Yet, standing here, in the heart of a strange forest, following a half-human woman who claimed his destiny was written in the stars, he couldn't help but feel the tug of something deep inside him. The journey was long, and the deeper they went into the forest, the more unfamiliar it became. Liam wasn't sure how much time had passed, hours, maybe days, The days blurred together as they made their way through the wilderness, with Lyra leading him through thick brambles, past hidden streams, and over ancient stone pathways that seemed older than the land itself. Her pace never faltered, but Liam's body began to feel the strain. He hadn't traveled this far in years, and the weight of his pack felt heavier with each step. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped sharply, and Liam felt the chill seep into his bones. Lyra, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, her furred skin providing her with a natural warmth that made her look almost otherworldly in the dim light. "We should rest," Liam said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We can't keep going at this pace." Lyra didn't immediately respond, but after a moment's consideration, she nodded. "You're right. We'll set up camp for the night." The area they found wasn't ideal. A small clearing in the woods with little shelter from the wind, but it was the best they could do. Lyra quickly set to work, gathering fallen branches and leaves, fashioning a small fire. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold night air. Liam sat back against a tree, his muscles aching as he tried to settle in. He watched Lyra as she moved around the camp, her every movement graceful and fluid. She had a way of carrying herself, an effortless strength in her posture that was both beautiful and intimidating. Her presence filled the space around them, making everything else seem distant and unimportant. As the fire crackled, Lyra finally sat down across from him, her amber eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. She didn't speak for a long while, but her gaze never left him. Liam, for his part, was lost in his thoughts. He had questions, so many questions, but none of them seemed to have easy answers. "What exactly is it you want from me?" Liam finally asked, his voice softer now. "What am I supposed to do in all of this?" Lyra's gaze softened just slightly, and for a moment, she seemed almost vulnerable. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to. The prophecy calls for a union between you and my people, yes. But beyond that, the choice is yours. It's not just about fulfilling some ritual. It's about what comes after, what happens when you choose to stand with us." Liam could see the sincerity in her eyes. He could feel the weight of her words. But still, he wasn't sure what to make of them. "And what if I don't want to stand with you?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Lyra's lips parted as if she were going to respond. But then she stopped herself, looking into the fire instead. The flickering flames cast long shadows across her face, and for a moment, Liam thought he saw a flash of something. Sadness, perhaps, but it was gone too quickly to be sure. "If you choose to walk away, I will not stop you," she said quietly. "But know this, the prophecy has already set things in motion. You are part of it now. Whether you walk with us or not, the path is already yours to follow." Liam was about to say something more when a sudden rustling in the bushes interrupted him. He instinctively reached for the hilt of his sword, his body tensing in readiness for a fight. Lyra's eyes darted to the movement, and she immediately stood, her posture shifting to one of alertness. The sound grew louder, and Liam's heart raced. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. This wasn't a coincidence. Out of the underbrush stepped a figure, a tall, hulking creature with furred legs and sharp claws. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light as it locked its gaze on them. Liam's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any animal. This was a predator. A warning. "Get ready," Lyra said, her voice low. "They're here." The tension between them crackled, both of them poised for action, knowing the dangers they would soon face. The night had just begun. The creature that emerged from the shadows was unlike anything Liam had ever seen. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, with muscular arms that rippled beneath its furred coat. Its face was a twisted mix of beast and human, sharp teeth glinting as it snarled in their direction. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling amber hue, mirroring Lyra's. The air grew thick with tension, the crackle of the fire doing little to ease the oppressive atmosphere. Lyra was the first to move, her body coiling with fluid grace. Her movements were sharp and controlled, her instincts honed by a life that blended humanity and the untamed wilderness. She stood between Liam and the creature, her stance ready for a fight. Liam, still shaken by the creature's appearance, instinctively reached for the sword at his side, but Lyra's voice cut through the mounting silence. "Stay back," she commanded, her eyes flashing with an intensity that told him not to question her. "I'll handle this." Liam hesitated, his grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. He wasn't sure he could just stand there while a beast of that size threatened them both. But there was something in her gaze, a quiet confidence, that stopped him. He stepped back, his mind racing, but his feet rooted to the spot. The situation was unfolding too fast for him to process everything. Lyra's amber eyes never left the creature. Her body was poised, a perfect blend of tension and readiness. She moved with the swiftness of a predator, her hands extending toward the creature, fingers curling as if to beckon it forward. She spoke in a low, guttural language that Liam didn't understand, but the tone was commanding, filled with authority. The creature stopped, its snarls faltering as it seemed to hesitate, as though recognizing something in her words. But the pause was brief. With a sudden roar, the creature lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air. Lyra leapt to the side, her movements a blur of agility, narrowly avoiding the strike. The creature's massive claws raked the earth, leaving deep gouges in the ground. It turned quickly, its glowing eyes locked on Lyra, and with another furious roar, it charged again. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to act, to do something to help, but he stayed rooted in place. He had never seen anything like this. Battles against men and beasts were one thing, but this was something different. Lyra's grace in the face of danger was mesmerizing, her every move precise and deliberate. She didn't seem to fear the creature, but instead seemed to dance around it, her own primal energy equal to its savage strength. The creature's roar filled the night again, and it slashed its claws at Lyra, but she sidestepped, moving in close. With a quick and fluid motion, she drew a dagger from her belt, her hand steady as she drove it into the creature's side. The beast howled in pain, staggering back, but its eyes burned with fury as it swiped at Lyra again. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he watched her fight, the raw power of her movements leaving him both in awe and worry. The creature was relentless, and although Lyra was faster and more agile, the creature's strength was overwhelming. It was only a matter of time before one of them faltered. But then something shifted. Lyra moved in close again, this time not to strike, but to stand face to face with the creature. She spoke softly, her voice a low murmur that Liam couldn't quite make out. The beast's movement slowed, its snarls fading as it seemed to listen to her, its posture shifting from aggressive to uncertain. For a long moment, there was silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The creature's amber eyes flickered between Lyra and Liam, and the tension in the air was palpable. Liam had no idea what was happening, but something in the creature seemed to calm as Lyra placed her hand on its chest, her fingers brushing gently through its fur. "Leave," she said quietly, her voice firm but gentle. "Go back to the clan." The creature let out a low growl, but it seemed to hesitate. Then, with a final glance at Liam, it turned and slowly retreated into the darkness of the forest, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had arrived. Lyra stood still for a moment, her hands still outstretched as if holding the creature in place. Finally, when it was gone, she let out a long breath and relaxed her posture, though her eyes remained alert. Liam's heart was still racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. He took a step forward, his sword still drawn, though he felt almost foolish for having been ready to fight. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Lyra glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "A trial," she said simply. "One of many." Liam's confusion deepened. "A trial? For what?" "To see if you're ready," she replied, her voice steady but cold. "To see if you're strong enough to survive the path that lies ahead. The creatures you'll face, the tests you'll endure. It's all part of the process. The prophecy doesn't just choose anyone. It chooses those who can withstand the trials." Liam frowned, his mind racing to catch up with her words. The idea of being tested, of being forced into some kind of trial, unsettled him. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had walked away from the violence of his past, but now it seemed the past was catching up to him. You didn't tell me this was part of the deal, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. I thought I was just supposed to be some kind of savior. I didn't know I'd be fighting. Lyra cut him off with a sharp look. The trials are not negotiable. They are the way of our people. If you cannot survive them, you will not fulfill the prophecy. It's as simple as that. Liam opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he had never imagined it would be this. The idea of being tested in this way, tested by forces he didn't understand, sent a cold shiver down his spine. But before he could say anything more, a sound broke through the night, a soft rustling, followed by a familiar voice calling out from the edge of the clearing. Lyra? The voice called, tentative but familiar. Lyra turned sharply, her posture immediately tense. Stay close, she whispered to Liam before stepping toward the source of the voice. Liam followed, his senses alert as they moved toward the newcomer. Whoever it was, they had just stepped into the heart of something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. Liam followed Lyra cautiously through the underbrush, his senses still alert from the confrontation with the creature. His heart had only just begun to slow when the soft voice, tentative, but with an edge of familiarity, reached his ears again. Lyra didn't hesitate, but moved with the same quiet purpose as before, as if she knew exactly what to expect. He, on the other hand, wasn't sure what to think. Whoever this person was, they clearly weren't a threat. But why did Lyra seem so tense? As they emerged from the trees, a figure came into view. The moonlight cast long shadows, but there was no mistaking the silhouette of a woman. She was tall, with striking features that were almost otherworldly. Her hair, silver and wild, cascaded over her shoulders in waves that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Her eyes, too, were strange, glowing faintly with the same amber hue that Liam had seen in Lyra. But there was something softer about her presence. She didn't move with the same sharpness as Lyra. Instead, she radiated a kind of quiet wisdom. Lyra, the woman said again, her voice filled with both relief and something else. Uncertainty, maybe? Lyra's shoulders relaxed just a fraction as she stepped forward to meet the newcomer. You came. I didn't think you would. The woman nodded, her gaze flicking between Lyra and Liam. I wasn't sure either, but I sensed you and I knew it was time. Liam took a step forward, his curiosity piqued. Who are you? His voice was cautious, but he couldn't help the urge to know more. This woman seemed important, and Lyra's reaction to her only added to the mystery. The woman turned her full attention to him then, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Her eyes seemed to see right through him. I am Kayla, she said, her voice soft but sure. I've been watching, waiting. For you. Liam blinked, caught off guard by her words. For me? He repeated, his brow furrowing. I don't even know what's going on here. First, I'm told there's a prophecy. Then I'm dragged into the middle of nowhere. And now you're saying you've been waiting for me. Kayla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his face. You are more important than you realize, she said finally, her voice low but filled with a kind of quiet authority. Your presence here is no accident. You are the catalyst for what is to come, whether you're ready for it or not. Liam felt a chill creep down his spine. What do you mean, what is to come? Chaos, Kayla said simply. War, and perhaps something more. She glanced at Lyra, her expression unreadable, then back at Liam. I don't know how much she's told you, but there are forces at work. Forces that will stop at nothing to see the prophecy fulfilled. Forces that will use you for their own ends. But there are also those who will try to protect you, though you may not always understand their methods. Liam didn't know what to say. Kayla's words were cryptic, and he wasn't sure whether to trust her. She didn't seem like a threat, but then again, neither did Lyra at first. The whole situation felt like one giant riddle, and he was the unwitting pawn in the middle of it all. Lyra stepped forward then, her expression hardening. That's enough, Kayla. He doesn't need to hear about the rest yet. Kayla didn't argue, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a kind of knowing that made Liam uneasy. Very well, Kayla said, her tone cool, but the time will come when he needs to understand. Soon. Liam looked between the two women, trying to make sense of the tension that hung in the air between them. Understand what? What is it you're not telling me? Lyra sighed, clearly frustrated. You're not ready for all of this, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. I told you there are trials. The prophecy is not just about physical strength. It's about more than that. It's about what you can withstand, who you are when everything is stripped away. Liam's patience was wearing thin. I've already had my fill of trials. The creature earlier. That was a trial, wasn't it? Kayla nodded, her gaze never leaving him. The first of many, and more will come. But it's not just about surviving. It's about what you choose to do with the power you have. Whether you will use it to help those who need you, or whether you will let it destroy you. Liam felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had wanted peace, a quiet life, away from conflict. Instead, he had been dragged into a world of prophecies, trials, and ancient forces that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. What happens if I fail these trials? He asked, his voice tense. Kayla's gaze softened, but only for a moment. If you fail, the consequences will be severe, not just for you but for everyone. The prophecy is not just some ancient myth. It is a reality, and you are at its center. Liam swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. What do you want from me, then? You've already said I'm part of this prophecy. Do you want me to fight? To what? Lyra stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm in a rare gesture of comfort. It's not about fighting, she said quietly. Not always. The prophecy is about balance, about unity. You and I. She paused, her words lingering in the air, heavy with meaning. We have a part to play in that balance. Liam looked at her, the confusion still clouding his mind. A part to play? In what? I can't tell you everything, Lyra replied. Not yet. The weight of her words hung between them, and for a moment, the fire crackled softly, filling the silence. Liam's mind was spinning. He wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but something in Lyra's expression held him back. There was sincerity in her eyes, and something else, something like fear. You have to trust me, she said, her voice quiet but firm. The trials you'll face are not just tests of your strength. They are tests of your heart. What you do with that power, how you wield it, will determine everything. Kayla stepped back into the shadows, her presence still looming over them. We will leave in the morning. There is much to prepare for. Liam nodded, though his mind was racing. He still had so many questions, and none of them had been answered. But one thing was clear. His life was no longer his own. The prophecy had already claimed him, and now he was bound to whatever came next. As Lyra and Kayla moved to set up camp for the night, Liam sat down on a nearby rock, his thoughts a tangled mess. The fire flickered before him, its light casting strange shadows in the night. He had never been more uncertain of his future. And yet, despite the fear that gnawed at his insides, a part of him couldn't deny the pull he felt toward this strange destiny. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the man he had once been, and the trials were only just beginning. The morning came too quickly. The coolness of the night faded as the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Liam had hardly slept, his mind too full of unanswered questions, of the strange and terrifying events he had witnessed. Lyra and Kayla had spent the night talking in hushed tones, their voices low and urgent. When Liam had tried to approach, they had both fallen silent, their expressions unreadable. He hadn't pushed them further. They clearly had their own secrets, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to uncover them yet. By the time the sky was fully lit, they were already packed and on their way, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees were dense here, their trunks towering high above, their leaves thick and dark. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and earth, and every so often, Liam could hear the faintest rustle of movement in the trees, an animal or perhaps something more. Kayla led the way now, her pace steady and confident, while Lyra stayed slightly behind with Liam. She had said little since the previous night, but every now and then, her amber eyes would glance over at him, assessing, as if weighing something in her mind. Liam didn't know what to make of it. It was clear that Lyra was involved in something much bigger than he had imagined, but the secrecy that surrounded it made him feel like an outsider in his own life. How much further? Liam asked after an hour of walking in silence. His muscles ached from the journey, and the sun was starting to beat down on them with increasing intensity. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze flicking between Kayla and the path ahead. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Not much longer. We're almost there." Liam nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He was tired, and the strain of the unknown was starting to wear on him. He had agreed to this journey because he had thought he had no other choice, but now, as the silence stretched between them, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake. The prophecy, the trials, the strange creatures, it was all too much to absorb at once. And yet, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this path was the only one that would lead him to answers. Whether those answers would be what he wanted, though, was still unclear. After another half hour, they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to a wide, open space. In the distance, Liam could see the crumbled remains of a structure, its stone walls half sunken into the earth. It was ancient, weathered by time, its once proud architecture now reduced to little more than ruins. "Here," Kayla said softly, turning to face them. She gestured toward the temple ahead. "This is where we begin." Liam's heart skipped a beat. The place was foreboding, the air around it thick with the weight of history. Something about it felt wrong, as if the very ground beneath their feet was alive with the echoes of long-forgotten memories. But despite the unease that crept into his chest, he couldn't deny the pull of curiosity. What was it about this place that made it so significant? Why had Kayla brought them here? "Is this the place you've been waiting for?" Liam asked, his voice steady but tinged with doubt. Kayla nodded. "This is the Temple of the Ancients. It was once a place of great power, a sanctuary for those who understood the true nature of the prophecy. But it has been lost for centuries, hidden away from the world. No one knows it exists, no one except for those who are meant to." Liam stared at her, still unsure of what to think. He had heard bits and pieces of the prophecy, words that felt like fragments of a dream, but now it seemed like the pieces were starting to come together. This temple was important, but in what way, and why was he the one being pulled into it? "We have to enter," Kayla said, her voice soft but urgent. "Time is running out." Lyra, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the temple. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kayla met her gaze with a level of calm that Liam couldn't quite match. "It is," she said firmly. "The prophecy leads us here. We have no choice but to follow it." Without another word, she began to walk toward the temple. Liam hesitated for only a moment before following her, with Lyra close behind. As they approached the entrance, a chill seemed to settle over them. The stone archway that framed the entrance was cracked, its edges worn down by time. Yet, as Kayla stepped forward, the massive doors of the temple slowly groaned open, as if welcoming them. Liam couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding as they entered the dark interior. The walls were lined with faded carvings, symbols and images of creatures and gods that seemed foreign and strange. The air inside was cool and heavy, and the smell of damp stone filled his nostrils. "Stay close," Lyra murmured, her hand brushing against his as they stepped further into the temple. Her touch was light but firm, and despite the danger that seemed to lurk in the air, he felt a strange sense of reassurance. They followed Kayla deeper into the temple, winding their way through narrow hallways that led to larger chambers. Each room was filled with strange relics and remnants of a time long past. But it wasn't the artifacts that caught Liam's attention. It was the energy that pulsed through the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, swirling around them like a tangible force. "What is this place?" Liam asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the ancient spirits that seemed to haunt the place. Kayla turned to face him, her expression serious. "This is where the trials begin," she said, her eyes shining with an intensity that sent a shiver down Liam's spine. "This is the heart of the prophecy, and the trials are not just physical. They will test your mind, your soul, your very essence." Liam swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had thought he understood what he was getting into, but now, standing in the heart of this ancient temple, he felt more lost than ever. "And what happens if I fail?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Kayla didn't answer immediately. She turned her gaze toward the farthest wall of the chamber, where a massive stone door stood. It was covered in intricate carvings, and though it looked centuries old, it appeared untouched by time. "This is where it begins," Kayla said finally. "The first trial." As she approached the door, Liam could feel the air grow thicker, the tension mounting with every step. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. The air in the temple grew heavy, almost oppressive, as they stood before the massive stone door. The walls around them seemed to pulse with energy, as though the temple itself was alive, watching, waiting for the trial to begin. Liam's heart raced in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, a steady reminder that this moment, whatever it was inevitable. Kayla reached for the door with a slow, deliberate movement. Her fingers brushed against the stone, and the carvings on the door seemed to shimmer in response, the symbols shifting and changing. She paused, as if listening to something only she could hear, then turned toward Liam and Lyra. "This is the first trial," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "It is a test of your will, your resolve, your ability to face the unknown without faltering." Liam glanced at Lyra, who met his gaze briefly before looking down at the floor. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke of a shared understanding. This trial wasn't just for him. It was for all of them. "Once the door opens, you will step through. Beyond it lies what you need to face," Kayla continued. "But be warned, the trial will manifest differently for each of you. It will show you things you fear, things you desire, and it will ask you to make a choice." A choice. The word echoed in Liam's mind, a reminder that nothing about this journey would be simple. He had hoped for answers, for some clarity to guide him through the confusion of the prophecy. But now it seemed as though the answers would only come with sacrifice. Kayla's hand tightened on the door, and with a deep, resonant groan, it slowly creaked open. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, as if the stone itself had swallowed all light. "Go," Kayla said. "It is time." Liam's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the pull of the unknown, an invitation and a warning all at once. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side, but he couldn't turn back now. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing just at the threshold of the door. Lyra followed behind him, her steps as steady as his, but he could sense her hesitation, the weight of the unknown hanging between them. Kayla stood back, her expression unreadable as the two of them crossed the threshold. The moment they stepped into the darkness, the air changed. It was thick and suffocating, like stepping into water, and Liam could feel the pressure on his chest, as if the world itself was pushing against him. He instinctively reached out for Lyra's hand, his fingers brushing against hers in the inky blackness. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sudden, overwhelming rush, the darkness seemed to twist and shift. Shadows danced around them, their movements erratic and unpredictable. Liam could feel them, could hear them, voices, whispers, and cries that seemed to rise from the very walls of the temple. They were incoherent at first, just noise, but gradually, they began to form words, speaking directly into his mind. "You are weak." Liam stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked around frantically, but all he could see was the darkness, the shapes shifting in the periphery of his vision. You are not strong enough, the voice continued, its tone cold and cruel. You will fail, like all the others. Liam's hands clenched into fists. The words stung, sharper than he had expected. He could feel the doubt seeping into his thoughts, the voice trying to root itself in his mind, trying to make him question everything he had believed about himself. The trials were meant to test him, but this was something else. This was a direct assault on his will, on his very sense of self. Don't listen to it, Lyra's voice cut through the darkness, a steady anchor in the storm of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. Her grip on his hand tightened, grounding him in the chaos. It's just a manifestation. You have the power to control it. Liam turned toward her, and for a brief moment, he could see the faint glow of her eyes in the darkness, a beacon of strength and certainty. He nodded, taking a deep breath, trying to block out the voices that still echoed in his mind. But then the darkness shifted again. This time, the shadows took form, coalescing into figures, dark, twisted versions of himself. They were reflections of his own fears, his doubts made flesh. One of the figures stepped forward, its face a grotesque mockery of his own. You think you're the one? The chosen one? It sneered, its voice dripping with contempt. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. Liam recoiled, but he couldn't look away. The figure's words dug into his mind like daggers, pulling up every insecurity, every failure he had ever experienced. He thought back to the years he had spent alone, working tirelessly in the shadows, only to be ignored, to be dismissed. He had never been the hero, never been the one who mattered. Stop it, he muttered under his breath. Stop. But the figures only laughed, circling around him, their voices growing louder and more frantic. Then, without warning, one of the figures lunged at him, its hand reaching for his throat. Instinctively, Liam stepped back, but the figure was faster. It grabbed him, pulling him into a crushing embrace, and for a moment, Liam couldn't breathe, the weight of his own self-doubt pressing down on him. But then, he felt Lyra's hand again, her touch warm and steady, pulling him away from the figure. You are not them, she said firmly, her voice slicing through the darkness. You are not what they say. You have the strength to overcome this. Liam gasped, his breath returning to him in shallow, ragged breaths. The figure that had held him dissolved into smoke, its form evaporating into the air. The darkness began to recede, its oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. He could feel the power of Lyra's words, the truth of them grounding him, reminding him that he was more than his fears. The whispers faded, the shadows dissipated, and for the first time since they had entered the trial, the air around him felt lighter, almost calm. The trial was far from over, he knew, but this was the first step. And somehow, despite the chaos, despite the doubts that had clawed at him, he felt stronger. Is it over? Liam asked, his voice hoarse as he looked around, half expecting the darkness to return. Kayla's voice, calm and resolute, answered from the doorway. The first trial is complete, but there is more to come. Liam and Lyra shared a look, both of them aware that the path ahead was uncertain, but they had crossed this threshold together, and that, at least, was something to hold on to. The air in the temple shifted again as they passed through the chamber, each step heavier than the last. The path before them seemed endless, the walls narrowing as the corridor stretched on, as though the very temple was closing in around them. Despite the faint light that now illuminated the space, the shadows felt thicker, more oppressive. Kayla led the way, her movements purposeful, while Lyra remained just behind Liam, her presence like a steady anchor. Liam could still feel the weight of the first trial on his shoulders, the echoes of the twisted versions of himself that had haunted him. The way they had mocked him, dredging up all of his insecurities, had been a ruthless test of his self-worth. But he had made it through. He had stood his ground, and with Lyra's support, he had overcome it. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Yet, as they approached the next chamber, a familiar unease crept back into his chest. What else was this temple going to throw at him? What would he face next? He thought about the prophecy, about the role he was meant to play, but it all felt like a distant dream now, something far too large for him to grasp. Kayla came to a halt in front of a heavy stone door, similar to the one they had passed through earlier. She turned to face them, her eyes gleaming with an unreadable expression. "This is the second trial," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something deeper. "This trial will test your heart, your desires. It will show you what you want most, but it will also ask you to choose between your deepest wishes and your duty." Liam's stomach tightened at the words. It wasn't just a test of his strength or will anymore. It was a test of his deepest desires, things he didn't even fully understand about himself. "Choose wisely," Kayla added. "This trial is the hardest to face." Lyra stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Kayla's face. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice low, yet determined. Kayla met her eyes with a flicker of something that almost looked like pity. "It means that what you see in the trial may not be what it seems. Your desires can be deceiving, and they will test your willpower like nothing else." The air grew thicker as Kayla's words settled over them, and Liam could feel his pulse quicken. The first trial had been difficult, but this was something else entirely. With a soft, almost imperceptible motion, Kayla pushed the door open. The creaking sound filled the silence, and the darkness beyond seemed to beckon them forward. Without a word, Kayla stepped into the shadowed room, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Lyra and Liam followed. The room they entered was vast and dimly lit, but it wasn't the size of the space that caught Liam's attention. It was the strange, surreal atmosphere that enveloped them. The air seemed to shimmer with energy, and the very walls felt like they were alive, responding to their presence. At the center of the room, a large mirror stood tall, its frame made of dark wood and intricate carvings. It was the only object in the room, the only thing that seemed solid in the shifting space. As Liam approached it, his heart began to race again. The mirror was no ordinary reflection. It felt as though it was alive, as if it held something far deeper than just his image. Kayla's voice interrupted his thoughts. "The mirror shows you what your heart desires most. It is a reflection of your deepest wish, but it will not be easy to face." Liam looked at her, his mind racing. His deepest wish? He wasn't sure what that was. He had spent so many years focused on surviving, on getting by, that he had never really considered what he wanted. What was it that he truly desired? The mirror began to hum softly, and slowly, its surface rippled. For a moment, Liam thought he imagined it, but then the ripples became more pronounced, the glass warping like water. And then the reflection began to form. Started slowly, a hazy figure at first, but then it became clearer. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he saw the image of a woman standing before him. Her features were familiar, soft, delicate, yet undeniably strong. Her amber eyes glinted with a warmth that reached out to him, and her long, dark hair framed her face like a veil. It was Lyra. Liam stumbled back, his heart racing as the image before him shifted and grew clearer. In the reflection, Lyra moved toward him, her face filled with longing, her lips parting as though she were about to speak. Her hand reached out toward the mirror, as if to touch him, and he could almost feel the warmth of her skin. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air around him grew still, as if the world had come to a halt. His mind was reeling, a whirlwind of confusion and desire. Why was Lyra here? Was this a trick, a manifestation of his deepest wishes? Or was it something more? His gaze flickered to the real Lyra standing beside him, her eyes wide and fixed on the mirror. She seemed as stunned as he was, though there was something unreadable in her expression, something he couldn't quite decipher. Liam's heart pounded in his chest, the longing in the reflection mirrored by the tightness in his own chest. But as he looked deeper into Lyra's eyes in the mirror, something shifted. Her expression changed, and the warmth turned to a cool detachment, her gaze distant and unreadable. The reflection of Lyra in the mirror began to fade, replaced by a new figure. The new image was that of a woman, but this time, she was someone Liam didn't recognize. She was ethereal, her long hair flowing like a waterfall, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that made his heart race. Her features were striking, almost otherworldly, and there was a mysterious allure to her that pulled him in. The air around him seemed to shift again, growing thicker, heavier. He reached out to the mirror, his fingers brushing against its surface. The woman in the mirror smiled at him, her lips curving upward in a knowing, seductive grin. "Who are you?" Liam whispered, though he knew the answer already. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to promise everything he had ever wanted, everything he had ever dreamed of. She reached out toward him, her hand coming to rest against the mirror. The reflection of Lyra, still standing beside him, faded even further, until it was nothing more than a shadow at the edge of his vision. He felt torn between the two images, the real Lyra, the woman he had come to trust, and the mysterious figure in the mirror, who represented everything he didn't fully understand but desperately desired. Kayla's voice broke through the tension, cold and clear. "This is the second trial. You must choose. What do you truly desire?" Liam's mind raced, caught between the familiar warmth of Lyra and the intoxicating pull of the unknown woman. His heart beat faster as the room seemed to spin, and for a brief moment, he wasn't sure if he could make a choice. But as he stood there, his hands still pressed against the cool surface of the mirror, he knew the truth. He had to make a choice, and it would change everything. The room felt heavier now, the air thicker with the weight of expectation. The mirror before Liam had become a battlefield of desire, confusion, and something much deeper, something primal. He stood frozen, his palms still pressed against the cool surface, watching as the woman's reflection, the vision, smiled at him with a knowing, seductive expression. Lyra's presence at his side was a grounding force, though it was barely enough to stop the storm of thoughts that raged inside him. Her silent observation was enough to make his heart pound with guilt, and yet, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the reflection. The woman in the mirror had a pull, an allure that was impossible to ignore, drawing him in like a flame pulling at a moth. But this wasn't real, was it? The woman, though mesmerizing, wasn't Lyra. She wasn't the person he had come to rely on, to trust with everything he had. He glanced over at Lyra, whose face was pale, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken since the vision had started to materialize, but Liam could feel the tension in the air around them. A soft, almost imperceptible voice broke the silence, and Liam turned to find Kayla watching him, her face betraying no emotion. "You must decide now, Liam. The mirror does not wait." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. What did he want? What was his heart telling him? The reflection in the mirror continued to beckon, her features glowing with an ethereal light, and for a brief moment, he could almost feel the warmth of her touch on his skin. The way her eyes locked onto his, the way her lips curved in that almost playful, yet undeniably sensual grin. It was enough to make his pulse quicken. Everything in him wanted to reach for her, to give in to the temptation, to choose the path that led to the unknown, the forbidden. But the reflection of Lyra lingered, no longer an image, but a feeling, an essence that he couldn't shake off. His thoughts flickered back to everything they had gone through, the connection they had formed, the nights they had spent talking, the quiet moments when he had found a kind of solace in her presence. She had stood by him when no one else would. Liam's heart twisted painfully in his chest as the mirror's reflection began to shift again. The woman's smile faded, replaced by an expression of something far colder. It was almost as though the mirror had read his thoughts, understood his hesitation. "Don't be fooled." Kayla's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze of confusion. "Desires are not always as they seem. This trial is meant to show you what you truly want, but what your heart wants is not always what is right for you. Choosing her," she gestured toward the reflection, "will only lead you further from the truth of your heart." Liam felt a jolt of realization, his breath hitching as Kayla's words settled in. This wasn't just a test of desires. This was a test of his soul, of everything he had built and everything he was about to become. He wasn't just choosing between two women. He was choosing who he wanted to be, what kind of man he wanted to become. The reflection of the unknown woman in the mirror had begun to twist, her features blurring with something darker, something more dangerous. It was as if the vision itself was collapsing under the weight of its own falsehood. And that's when Liam realized this wasn't real. The woman wasn't real. Lyra, standing beside him, was real. The bond they had formed was real. And it wasn't a fleeting connection. It wasn't something that could be discarded so easily for a seductive vision that promised pleasure without consequence. Lyra's gaze flickered toward him, her eyes searching his face, though there was a depth in her gaze now that hadn't been there before. She was waiting for him to make a choice, but not just any choice. She was waiting for him to choose her, for him to choose the future they could build together. Liam turned to the mirror again, and this time he saw it for what it truly was, a reflection of his own longing, his own loneliness. The temptation was powerful, but he couldn't deny what his heart was telling him. With a slow, deliberate movement, Liam pulled his hand away from the mirror. The glass rippled and distorted, as though it had been wounded by his refusal. He stepped back, his chest heaving, and the mirror's surface began to settle, the images dissipating into nothingness. The room fell silent. Lyra's breath seemed to catch in her throat, and she stepped forward, her hand hesitantly reaching for his. Her fingers brushed against his, and there was a gentle, almost imperceptible tension in the air between them. Liam looked down at her, his heart thundering in his chest. She was here, she was real, and she was everything that mattered. Kayla's voice broke the stillness once more, but this time it was different. There was a glint of approval in her eyes, though it was brief. "You have chosen wisely," she said, her tone cool but with a note of respect. "But the trial is not over yet. There are more choices to be made. The path ahead will not be easy." Liam felt the weight of her words sink in. He had chosen Lyra, and yet something told him that the hardest part of the trial was still ahead. There was more to this than just choosing between desires. This was a journey of the heart, of discovering the truth of who he was and what he was capable of. Lyra squeezed his hand, her fingers threading through his with a quiet intensity. "We're in this together," she whispered, her voice steady but filled with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Liam nodded, his gaze holding hers. Together. But as they stood there, Kayla motioned for them to continue, the shadows in the room deepening. The trial was far from over, and the choices ahead would test them in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. As they stepped forward once more, Liam could feel the weight of the next trial pressing down on them, the uncertainty of what was to come hanging like a storm cloud in the distance. And as the door to the next chamber creaked open, they walked into the unknown. The air in the next chamber was cool, the walls lined with shimmering stones that glowed faintly, casting soft, ethereal light across the space. It felt like they had stepped into a different world entirely, one that was both alien and familiar. Liam's footsteps echoed softly on the smooth stone floor, his hands still entwined with Lyra's. The weight of the moment hung heavily around them, a quiet tension settling between them. Kayla's voice rang out behind them, cutting through the silence with the same sharpness it had held since their arrival. "This is the final trial. The path you choose here will determine not only the outcome of your journey, but the future of your bond." Liam turned to face her, his heart still pounding from the choices they had already made. "What do you mean by the future of our bond?" he asked, his voice rough with both confusion and determination. They had already chosen each other once, hadn't they? Wasn't that enough? Kayla's gaze was unreadable as she stepped forward, her eyes flickering to Lyra before settling back on Liam. "The bond you share is more than a mere connection of hearts. It is a link of fate, a tie that will have consequences beyond what you understand. But be warned, there are always sacrifices in such a bond. You must decide if you are willing to face them, or if you will turn away from what lies ahead." Liam's chest tightened at her words, but before he could respond, the chamber began to change. The walls shimmered once more, the light flickering as though caught in a gust of wind, and in an instant, a vision appeared before them. It was a scene from the past, one that Liam instantly recognized. It was the first night they had spent together, the moment when he had realized just how much Lyra meant to him. The vision was vivid, as if they were watching the event unfold in real time. He could feel the warmth of her touch, the softness of her laughter, the weight of her presence beside him. But as the vision played out, something shifted. The image of Lyra began to blur, distorting until it became another figure entirely. The figure was tall, with an unfamiliar, ethereal beauty, her eyes glowing like the reflection in the mirror from before. The vision of Lyra was replaced, and in its place was an image of something darker, something alien and alluring. Liam stepped forward, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking to Lyra. Lyra's face was pale, her expression strained as she met his gaze. "It's the temptation of what could be," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "It's the choice between us, Liam, between the life we could have and the life you were meant to live." The vision before them shifted again, and this time, the images of both Lyra and the unknown woman overlapped, their faces merging into one. It was a hauntingly beautiful sight, and yet it left Liam with a feeling of discomfort, as though something was fundamentally wrong. Kayla's voice broke through the confusion, her tone sharper now. "The trial has already begun, Liam. You have already chosen once, but now you must choose again. The choices before you are not simple. This is the final test of your heart." Liam's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The vision was a twisting blend of possibilities, each one more tempting than the last. The woman in the vision, a creature of light and shadow, beckoned him with her gaze, her lips slightly parted, as though waiting for him to step forward. She was everything he had ever wanted, mysterious, powerful, and so utterly different from anything he had ever known. But his gaze shifted back to Lyra. Her presence grounded him. The love and connection they shared, the trust they had built over time, were far more real than anything he could find in the shifting illusion before him. He had already made his choice, hadn't he? He had chosen Lyra once before, and he would choose her again. The temptation of the unknown, of the dangerous allure of the unknown woman, was strong, but it was fleeting. It was an illusion, a trap set to lead him astray. The vision faded before him, and in its place, Lyra stood, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. She reached for his hand, her fingers wrapping around his with a gentle but firm grip. "We've come this far together," she whispered. "We'll face whatever comes next together." Liam nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "Together," he repeated, his voice steady with certainty. Kayla stood quietly, watching them both. She had not moved throughout the vision, but there was something in her gaze now, a flicker of something that might have been pride, or perhaps understanding. "The trials are not always about the choices we make," Kayla said, her voice softening just a fraction. "Sometimes, they are about discovering the strength to hold fast to what matters most. You have found that strength, Liam. That is the true test." With those words, the vision before them shifted once again, but this time it wasn't a vision of temptation. Instead, the chamber filled with a soft, golden light. The stones in the walls glowed brighter, and the oppressive feeling of uncertainty lifted. Liam turned to Lyra, and for the first time since they had entered this strange place, he felt the weight of everything that had come before them release, if only for a moment. They had made it through the trials together. They had chosen each other, not just out of desire, but out of love and trust. A soft sigh escaped Lyra's lips, and she smiled at him, a smile that was both warm and knowing. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet hope. Liam took a deep breath, feeling the certainty settle in his chest. "Yes," he said, his heart swelling with a sense of peace. "But whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Kayla's final words echoed in their minds as the chamber brightened around them. "The trials are over, but your journey has just begun." And as they walked hand in hand, leaving the final trial behind them, Liam knew that the future they faced would not be without challenges. But whatever came next, they would face it together, their bond unbroken, their hearts intertwined. The true test was not in the choices they had made, but in the choices they would continue to make side by side. And as the door to the next world opened before them, they stepped forward, together, into the unknown, knowing that the future was theirs to shape.